Hopefully Noah has some countermeasures to what Nick was sharing, but also just excited to have Noah share blue team techniques. Noah, I'll let you kind of give a little bit of background, but you come from Black Hills and just a deep background in SOC and SOC analysts. So everyone, we're excited. We'll try to keep on time here, because like these are shorter sessions. So I want to make sure we're mindful of everybody's time. But Noah, great to have you speaking. I'm going to let you take it away.
All right. Thanks, Dan. I do want to start with, Nick was really talking me up. And initially when Nick and I were talking about doing this and riffing off each other a little bit, it was like, oh yeah, no, I'm going to come back with like an equally technical blue team talk. And then I saw Nick's presentation. I was like, yeah, that I started. I promise I started, but it didn't work out quite that way. Instead, I decided what I wanted to do was rather cover the concept of how we establish trust. Like, what is trust? How do we come to the conclusion of like, yeah, that JIRA is something we can trust and this one is not? Because yeah, what Nick just showed us is what attackers are just doing. I mean, they've been doing it before, but he's got a novel way of doing it at the same point. I mean, we have applications like, GCAT and Sneaky Creeper and all of the other cool stuff that Nick's doing on his side. And I said, I rather than be like, oh yes, this is how you catch this one thing, I kind of wanted to go a little bit into my methodology of like, how would I investigate something like this as a blue teamer? How do we pursue an investigation of something like this? Because as we're going to talk, in the legitimate world, we're also using all these applications and they're just as sketchy as when the attackers are using them. So that's kind of what we're covering. Just a quick note, this is a concept, not a technique. I'm not like going to tell you that this is going to like help you catch more malware. I think it would, but it's a concept. Do not take this literally. Read between the lines a little bit. So the little bit, since Nick was talking about phishing, like that prompts this obligatory rant of mine, which is that personally I feel security is just as much about teaching as it is about actually securing things. And I will fight people who argue against that sometimes, because it's people are going to mess up, and that's okay. When you're a software developer and you do software development and you see a JIRA invite come in, you're just going to click it because it's JIRA, and that's fine. When you're an accountant and you see someone send you a PDF, one of the like most eye-opening things was I was sitting down with an accountant one day, and they showed me their inbox. And I'm like, if you've never seen the inbox of an accountant, I highly recommend you go check it out, because it was full of, please pay this, insert PDF, or please pay this, link to payment website, And I'm like, oh, this is absolutely terrible. Why is no wonder you have a hard time with some of your phishing tests, because we are security professionals. We can look at a fish and be like, oh yeah, that's a fish, because that's what we're trained to do. However, we cannot file corporate taxes because that's not what we do. So sometimes we get in this habit of like, yeah, if people just stop clicking phishing emails, that'd be great. And meanwhile, what the users are actually doing is they're walking in this minefield, like this mouse here, basically. And they're like, oh, what do you mean? Again, like, please pay this link. So that is more or less the part of it. Because and the reason we need to be talking with people is like, it's just as important that your end users trust security as it is that your security can trust processes, the things that the end users are doing, and the end users themselves. Whereas when we get into this habit of like, oh, because security said so, don't do this thing, that's going to be a problem. And you'll see that's a little bit of a reoccurring thing that comes up through this. The main part of this talk is good versus evil analysis. So first, there's a lot of claims of like, if you see X, then this process is evil. And I say process. This could be a web service. I call some of the web service stuff out. This could be a actual Windows process. I do a lot of Windows process investigations, so there's a lot of that focused here. There's a lot of these claims that are like, hey, if X, then this process is evil. One of my favorites is people will be like, oh, if you see net commands, those are evil. Yeah, they're not. Sorry. But working in an MSSP has shown us that that's not so much the case. We see net commands get ran all the time. They're not always evil. We'll follow an investigation all the way through and be like, oh, this was a totally normal use of net commands. We see, sketchy emails that are coming in that are like, hey, join the, like, basically click this link to join this Jira board. And people click them because they do Jira. So like the vendor software is just as sketchy sometimes as the actual attackers, which really blurs the lines. And it doesn't help when Nick is doing things like he just showed you, where he's blurring the lines even more using legitimate vendor software to do it. So how do we investigate that? So like some of the weird stuff that we have is like this is just pretty much standard Windows stuff. I just went through some tickets and I was like, yeah, I'm gonna find some of the weirdest stuff I can. Like, that might be malware. Interestingly enough, this is what your system runs. This top command line here is what your Windows system runs when you want to print to a file. I don't know, but like if I see shell 32 popping up, like that's gonna be something that I don't necessarily, I'm just going to get my attention as an investigator. Same with DFShim. Like if you see stuff like this, this is a pre-compiled application. It was totally legitimate, but how would I know? Like, because it was from a vendor, like the vendor shipped it like this. It wasn't not pre-compiled. It was compiled at runtime. Turned out to be completely legit. Another one that I remember was at one point I was doing support assist from Dell. And I remember my security team called me. I'm like, what are you doing? And I was like, I'm just working on admin task. I don't know what you mean by what am I doing? They're like, why did you just fire off like 30 double tagged files, like PDF.exe type files? I'm like, I didn't. I just ran the installer to set up this support assist program. Yeah, that program is like super sketch in some of the things it does. It's great. Another fun one, TS client, like this was actually just like an accidental click thing, but we saw it and it was legit. Just users doing user stuff. Another one, a lot like net, is arp.exe. If you see ARP, a lot of people be like, oh, if you see ARP, it's got to be bad. As someone who's worked with PLCs and customers that have PLCs and stuff like that, I'll tell you right now, it's in the manual for a bunch of different types of PLCs that, hey, when you want to try to figure out how to configure your PLC, run arp.exe tac A. You'll see it. It's first question you ask, like, do they have PLCs there? Oh, yeah. It's probably not someone performing recon in your environment. It's probably just your PLC engineer doing PLC engineer stuff. Verify. Definitely. At no point am I saying don't investigate these things. What I am saying is don't take it as like, oh, this is evil, and then you freak out when you see stuff like this, because it's not always evil. Another fun one here is like in your network, the vendor is doing really sketchy stuff sometimes. So at one point, and like before we get into the whole talks about Yahoo DNS, but there was one time I was doing a investigation. I'm like, why is there all these subdomains of Yahoo DNS? Looks just like DNS over C2 or C2 over DNS. This is really strange. And so we investigated it. Turns out this is how Yahoo does ad tracking. Don't know if you knew that or not. If you've ever wondered what this was, yeah, this is how Yahoo does ad tracking via just sending JSON data to a bunch of DNS queries. So yeah, sketchy stuff done by vendors. Even in real life, we have stuff like where we're seeing like just standard tailgating, where that's sometimes sketchy. Because we'll have a vendor. My favorite was coming somewhat from a manufacturing background. We would have vendors occasionally who'd be like, oh, well, I'm here to work on this thing on the roof. And be like, okay. And they're like, yeah, I need to go through that door. And I'm like, do you have a card? And we're like, well, no, they only gave us one card, which that's a whole other conversation. But we get used to our vendors doing stuff. And then we get mad at people because we're like, well, how could you click the link? How could you allow this to happen? And you're like, what do you mean? How could I allow this to happen? We use Jira every day. We use Cloudflare. It was from a Microsoft site. How can you be mad at me about this? So just something to keep in mind. So how do we establish trust? I tried to, meme this one up a little bit. So context is the thing that I'm trying to like push with this whole thing, which is the number one hardest thing to try to explain to a new analyst. So with this here is like, is this net.exe command evil? Well, that depends on the context. Is it malware, or is it just your asset management software? Because that's what I see running net commands all the time. To the point where I'm like, hey, if you ever want to run a net command, just pretend to be the asset management software. Nobody's going to suspect that, and there's probably an exclusion in your EDR for that. So yeah, we see that plenty. So the context of it is super important. Is net used by people doing evil things? Absolutely. I'm not saying discount it. What I am saying is get more context. There's kind of some things I'm going to check. It's not a who, what, when, where. It looks like a who, what, when, where. It's not a who, what, when, where. But when you're looking at, you're going to want to try to take the context of like who's doing this. So if you have a user, that's going to be your who. Sometimes it might be the web server or whatever, but your who is the people involved here. Assuming that your users are insider threats is not necessarily my recommended like go-to thing. I've seen analysts do it. There's a number of like trust issues that come up with assuming immediately that your users are insiders. So I wouldn't recommend starting there. That's a whole other talk. Again, you want your users to trust security. If they don't feel like security trusts them, that's going to be a problem. So sometimes your users are just ignorant and they just need to be taught right from wrong. Again, security is just as much about teaching as it is about actually securing things. Sending a nasty email to someone and be like, you failed your phishing test, I'm going to reset your password, because it is not exactly going to make friends with security. It's going to make them really dislike security. And when they get an actual phishing email and they click it, they're not going to want to tell you about this. This isn't new. I'm not going to beat this, but that's, it is what it is. So when they actually do mess up, like teach them. If it's a common problem, I'm not saying like go to every one of their desks and be like, hey, so you click this phishing link on this day, and I would really like to show you what you did wrong. That's going to take forever. Like we have limited amounts of time. I get it. But you can make sure that you're at least sending out emails that are not, hey, you're all terrible. I'm going to reset all your passwords. But like the last phishing test, we had a lot of people fail. I would like to cover how that goes on. Set up a round hall, whatever you want. Now, there is another aspect. Sometimes they are trying to bypass your security controls. That's not always, that always should be addressed. But sometimes you kind of ask for it when you set your security controls way too tight. If you set your security controls so tight that they can't access, things that normal people want to access. My favorite was like, at one point I was talking with someone. They're like, oh, we don't allow guest Wi-Fi here. Like, this is a concrete building. What do they do on their break? Like, oh, that is not our problem. We don't allow guest Wi-Fi here for security reasons. I'm like, okay, cool. Can I see your logs? And they're like, yeah, sure. Let's see the logs. And I'm like, oh yeah. So you see all these logs where your end users are turning on the Wi-Fi hotspot on their laptop and connecting to it? That's what happens when you don't provide a guest network so they can get on Facebook over their lunch break, or TikTok or whatever else. And instead, what you're doing is routing them through your corporate network. By tightening your security controls, your users are going to still try to do what they need to do, either for their job or for their break. It doesn't matter. And this is especially the case for students. I was talking with a bunch of IT people for like the schools in Missouri a while back. And I started out, I'm like, I gotta apologize because I was a terrible student. And my thing was at one point we did, the school gave us all iPads, but they made the content restrictions so locked down that you could access like 3 sites. And we all just wanted to get on Netflix or Hulu or whatever else. So we started working our way around that. Before long, there was this whole underground thing of like iPad VPNs going on. So first we just set up a simple IPsec VPN. School caught on to it. And we were like, oh, well, they blocked our IPsec communications. So then we started working on like SSL VPN stuff and figured out how to do SSL VPN. And they caught, we started with SSL VPN over UDP. They caught that. Then eventually we started routing SSL VPN on port 443. So that they couldn't block it because they would block their teachers from the internet, as well as like the 3 sites that they did want us to have access to for school stuff. So yeah, students are particularly bad at this because they're bored, and there's nothing worse than someone who's bored with a lot of time on their hands and they really want to get on Netflix. That's like the ultimate person to try to like get you to pen test. Sorry to all the pen testers I offended there, but like seriously, get like a 16-year-old who wants on Netflix and they'll find a way through your network. I guarantee it. Now that we've gone through that whole thing, when you're looking at the who's, like, does this activity make sense for that user? What was the user trying to accomplish? Even if they are trying to subvert your security controls, What were they trying to accomplish? Like, were they trying to do their job? I've seen times where users are actually trying to do their job, and the security was blocking them from being able to do their job because they didn't like that application or something. Then they found a way around it. You can't be doing that. We have to support like operations as well. If you have it and you're doing an investigation, you're looking to check the UEBA. If it's something off by the user, it's not that user, that'll hopefully tell you some of that stuff. If you don't have UEBA, then you can still do some UEBA type analysis where you're checking, have they logged in from this IP address before? Is this really their computer? Some of that stuff, just basic checking on stuff. But like the big thing is to keep in mind the context of why are they trying to do this? Because the user didn't necessarily do it for no reason. Maybe they downloaded that cheap Chinese web browser because they didn't like Chrome. That might not necessarily be the best option. And we might need to explain to them why they need to stick with Chrome and not, sketchy Chinese web browsers. But we need to have that conversation because security says so is not enough. It might be that Chrome doesn't properly render whatever something is that they're using for their software. That's a possibility. Talk to your end users. Don't just assume they're trying to be insiders or whatever. All right. Next thing is where. And this goes to both websites, processes, a lot of different types of investigations. You can tell a lot about a potential threat based on where it's running from. If it's my favorite is one of Spotify. I think I was talking to someone on Twitter about this a while back. Like, how do I prevent my users from installing Spotify without setting up app locker on my entire environment? And I'm like, no, that's pretty much the only way, because Spotify, Zoom, GoToMeeting, all of these various apps, they install an app data, which is user land. So that way you don't need admin or you don't need no admin permissions to set it up and install it, because they want you to be able to install it. I mean, think about it for a second. Teams doesn't want you to have to go call your admin and request that Teams get installed on your computer, or Zoom or any of those guys. They want you to just be able to install it and go to your meeting. So that's why this exists. Same thing gets used for malware, keeping in mind the context of what it means if you're installing an app data versus program files. Sometimes you'll see legit malware try to install in program files, but if it's installing in program files, there's a good chance it might just be a regular program trying to install, because that's a protected directory. Not always. Again, this is not like do this, don't do this. It's think about it. Here's another, this is Teams running out of app data. And if you, what I pulled out, like this command line here, if this doesn't look sketchy, then I don't know what does. So yeah, there's that. This is from AC Hunter, the where for your websites and stuff, like things like DigitalOcean. It's really easy to set up a server on DigitalOcean. It's a little bit harder to set up a malware server on other services. Not saying it's impossible, but like something to keep in mind. Context, think about it, all that stuff. What does it do? No, Joel, you're missing the point. Not that DigitalOcean is bad, because if you run on the assumption that DigitalOcean is always bad, you're going to wind up blocking some legitimate service someday when it installs on DigitalOcean. Seen it happen. It's gonna happen. I promise you. So what does it do? You can profile your malware, your malicious website, your potential threat based on a couple of different things. What is it doing? What is it doing that's like malware, like legitimate services? So profile on things like loaded libraries, network connections, ports, and files created. Like, does it act like malware? Do you or your team actually understand what malware looks like and acts like? Or does it act like a legitimate system? Do you know what that acts like and looks like? This is, I'll get to that part, what that is. But yeah, so I've got a couple things here. If you ever want to know what malware starts looking like, if you want to look into like recon and enumeration, run WinPs with like sysmon installed, and then just start researching all the things it's looking at, because that will teach you a ton about like potential security vulnerabilities in your systems. This zoom update.iso here, super common way to avoid EDR. That's a thing. Use of PS exec, that's a thing. So yeah. What, like that whole, like, does it act like malware? Does it act like a legitimate system? That's a thing that takes a lot of time to learn. And in the industry, we like to call it experience. That gets misconstrued sometimes as to like how many years you've worked in security. That's wrong. It's more about how many times have you seen malware? How many times have you seen legitimate systems? Like, how much have you seen? That's your experience stuff. So how do you learn some of that stuff? So there's some people that are looking to get into SOC analyst, stuff like that. How do you learn that? Start with sysmon. Also process monitor from sysinternals. It's going to show you what is normal. And you can use that to help baseline out what Windows looks like. This is kind of what I did at one point, was just install it, figure out what are all the inner workings of Windows. It's a whole lot easier than typing into Google, what are the inner workings of Windows, because it's going to give you just a ton of junk. Install sysmon. Then once you have that figured out, once you've established what normal looks like, go play with some malware. Not on your home computer, set up a VM, be smart about it. But go play with some malware in sysmon and look at what it's doing, look at what it's changing. You can learn a ton about how ransomware works by running ransomware. And then when you see it, you're primed. You're like, I've seen this before. That looks like ransomware, because ransomware is going to do things. It's going to load cryptography libraries. It's going to create like certain types of file extensions. It's going to just touch every file in the system. Like, yeah, and with ransomware, you don't really want to be joking around with it. You want to know what it looks like. You don't want to be like, I don't know. That looks like it might be sort of ransomware, but I don't know what ransomware looks like. So I think I'm just gonna, do like a standard ticket escalation. It'll be fine. I'm sure it's fine. No, ransomware moves really fast. Don't mess with ransomware. But yeah, then get into your OS as deep as you can. Eventually, with Windows, you'll start looking into things like DPAPI, and your brain will be like, why did I do this? And that's when like you're on the right track. When your brain says, I hurt. Why are you doing this to me? So yeah, bringing this all together, like what Nick was saying, like where you're using trusted sites that already are capable of doing sketchy things. Vendors are using them for sketchy things. How do we pull this all back together? And the answer is with context. So that's what my whole talk is, context. So with that, we can inform a decision. We can come to a conclusion like, yeah, there's a lot of sketchy stuff going on, and the context is not there. Yeah, Dan said it like right there. Context. Like, it's all about context. That's the whole talk. I could have just titled it context, but yeah, we didn't just do it because, EDR said it was evil. We didn't just do it because someone on Twitter said, if you see net commands, they're evil. We did it because we actually looked at the whole context of the situation, and that can help you solve a lot of problems. So, and for whoever's talking about commas, probably true. Dyslexia is fun, But yeah, that's the talk. So I think I saw some questions.
Yeah, if you've got some questions, feel free to throw them either in the Discord or in the Q&A section of the Zoom. That was great. I wrote some notes. So basically, the blue team has to discern a hacker from a red teamer, from a vendor, from users trying to bypass their system, and 16-year-olds trying to get out to Netflix. Right.
So. Well, and when it's user trying to bypass the system, it's because they're trying to do things that we've intentionally blocked that they need to have at some point.
So you're saying this is an easy job, is what you're
yeah, it's super simple. Basically, there is the reason. No, actually, to be all serious, like I was gonna be sarcastic about, but I'm gonna be all serious. The reason why we don't have AI that can do this yet is because it's really hard to teach the AI to look at the whole context. This is what makes a security analyst a security analyst. It's not, I've had analysts before ask like, oh, well, I just wish it was like black and white. I'm like, no, it's never black and white. It's like always this hazy gray. And yeah.
Yeah. No, I that's why I was going with that, is like that this is not something that's just easily automated, right? If we'd have been there, if it was, we'd be there by now.
Yeah,
right?
If I had a solution to automate this and like make like, oh yeah, it's this simple. There's just a logical solution to every investigation. I would not be here. I'd just be like sitting on a beach somewhere because I'd have this like $1 million product.
Yeah, exactly. And then you've got, guys like Nick, and then we'll also hear from David, who is like, hey, they're constantly like figuring out ways to keep bypassing the next controls that you put into place. So it's like that context that just is a perpetual thing. It's it's not just something that you just set it and forget it. There's a question here. It's like, you talk about trying to discern ransomware. What screams to you as ransomware outside of IOCs, hashes, IPs, etc.?
There's of course the different types of ransomware. If we're just talking about your standard like worming ransomware, one, if it's actually worming, you'll see that on multiple systems, which is also something you can use for context. Like, what are other systems in your environment doing? Is this application something we see being ran regularly? Is this something that is just fired off right now? also worms have their own entire profile that you can set up. But one of the big ones I almost always am starting to look for is cryptography libraries being loaded or downloaded to be loaded with it. And that's going to be a pretty good indicator. I mean, you still need your IOCs. Your IOCs are part of the context. I couldn't like list everything that's part of the context, but yeah, IOCs are definitely part of a context. But looking at behavior as a whole picture is more what I'm looking for.
Yeah. No, that's great. And just to kind of like tease, like, I think these first two sessions were fantastic, right? Because it's like, it's really showing how like, hey, context is king. And so from a red team perspective, knowing what the blue team's context is helps them adapt their attack techniques. The blue team knows, hey, I need to adapt to these types of threats in our environment. And that kind of bridges the gap for that purple team concept that we'll kind of talk about later in the day. So just to tease that out there, I think it's
well, and that's where purple teaming comes in is I talk with Nick and I say like, yeah, these are things I can't detect right now. And Nick's like, oh, cool. I'm going to like mobilize on that. And you're like, oh crap. Now I have to figure out how to detect that.
Yeah, exactly. So it's how we work together, right? So
I mean, that's the definition of purple teaming: grinding it smooth, working together, doing some techniques, grinding and finding telemetry and tools to either detect it, block it, or do something that makes it bubble up.
Yeah,
right. Absolutely.
Yeah. Because Nick's not going to just be all like, "Oh, look at that, I did it," and then laughs at you and moves on, right? It's like, "Hey, we're going to have to figure out how to help you."
Not the second time, only the first time.
Right. First time, yeah.
Well, and the nice thing is that once Nick makes the tool, I could start profiling it to just say like, okay, this is how this tool acts. Like, these are the things that it's going to touch. Yeah, exactly. That's much different from a signature. That's almost like human EDR, but and there's more than just like the behavior patterns and everything else. It's like I said, again, context.
Yeah, exactly.